My Lords, will the Minister not agree that one thing that could make a really big difference to this appalling situation would be a change in regime and free and fair elections? He will have noted that the European Parliament concluded that the last elections were neither free nor fair and in fact were violent. And what more can we do to ensure there is this multi-party democracy? And will he find time to meet the outstanding new leader of the opposition, Joel Sessegnoni, who is a brave young politician who deserves our support?
I thank my noble friend. I would just say that we will work with any government of Uganda. They are important allies, they're members of the Commonwealth, they are doing important work elsewhere in Africa for peace and security. But it is only through having a good, friendly relationship with a country like that we can state how appalled we are at legislation such as this. And so, obviously, we want to promote free and fair elections at every stage, but the government of Uganda is the government of Uganda. They are doing great things in support of peace and security in Africa, and we support that. But this is an unacceptable regression of freedoms and personal rights.
It's not only the voice of government that needs to be heard, it's the voice of civil society. And I've welcomed the government's contribution in the past to the Commonwealth Equality Network. But we can do more, making sure faith voices are heard, making sure trade union voices. What is his department doing, working with the international trade union movement, who have very good policies on this, to influence people in those countries? So it's not just seen as a UK government action, but it's a civil society action that can be appalled at these laws.
I think I can reassure the noble lord. I met with our High Commissioner to Uganda this week, and she gave me details of many of the projects we are doing with civil society, with organisation, and some of our overseas development assistance money goes, for example, funding grassroots efforts to shift attitudes on gender-based violence, and there are many other things that we are doing. And he's right that many faith-based organisations are key to this. One of the unfortunate drivers of this legislation has been promoted by an evangelical view of Christianity, and not one that many of us who would ascribe to Christian values being one of compassion and kindness. It seems to be one of quite the reverse. And I know that many faith-based organisations want to have nothing to do with that and want to try and correct that. And we will work with anybody who is seeking to support people affected by this legislation.
Dr. Paul Williams to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I beg to move that this House has considered democracy in Uganda. Serious concerns have been raised internationally about the Ugandan government systematically undermining democracy in their country. MPs have been arrested, institutions that should protect the democratic rights of citizens are being weakened, and the voices of ordinary Ugandans are being ignored. The United Kingdom is a friend of Uganda. We are important partners in trade, in development, in security. And, Madam Chair, I am a friend of Uganda too. Uganda and the UK have a shared past, and I hope we will have a strong and prosperous shared future together too. But at the start of this debate today, it's important to ask, what is the UK's interest in Uganda, and whether that gives us a legitimate right to make any comment about its democracy? I firmly believe that Uganda should be valued as an equal partner to the UK. But it hasn't always been an equal partnership. Our relationship began in 1894. Until 1962, Uganda was what was known then as a British protectorate. Now, Uganda is an independent, sovereign nation, and it has been throughout my lifetime. It has a constitution that describes a balance of power between an executive, a legislature, and other independent bodies. I respect the Ugandan constitution. It's right for Uganda, and it's right for the Ugandan people. That constitution protects the Ugandan people. It's the rock on which Ugandan democracy is built. and the relationship between our two countries should always respect the Ugandan constitution. President Museven has been in power for 33 years this month. 3/4 of people in the country haven't ever lived under a different leader. The Ugandan people can see that the institutions of their democracy are slowly being eroded. Firstly, the government has closed down critical media outlets. There are credible reports that television stations were interrupted during the 2016 elections when results were being reported that favoured the opposition. There are also credible reports that social media, including Facebook and Twitter, is shut down by the government during sensitive times. Secondly, the government has used the military to attack Parliament. When MPs were debating the extension of presidential term limits, Parliament was attacked and MPs, including Betty Nambuze, were beaten by armed forces. Thirdly, there's evidence of serious human rights abuses. There are serious and credible reports about an attack in Kisese on the palace of King Charles Mubere in 2016 and the massacre of 150 civilians by Ugandan forces. According to these reports, the soldier who led this attack has been promoted and no independent investigation has taken place. Hopefully the Minister will give the government's position on this attack. Fourthly, elections have been described in diplomatic language as being short of being free and fair. Serious allegations have been made about the conduct of elections in Uganda over many years, but the most recent EU report on the 2016 presidential election made 30 recommendations that should be enacted before the next election, which happens in 2021. Now, there are many Ugandan opposition politicians who've struggled bravely to use the democratic process to win power. There isn't time to mention all of them here, but I'd like to draw attention to two people. Kizza Besigye has stood for president on 3 occasions. He's been arrested, beaten and harassed so many times that he's lost count. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Besigye when he visited our parliament last year. His sacrifices in the pursuit of democracy in Uganda should be lauded. And I also want to mention Robert Kyagulanyi, also known as Bobi Wine. Kyagulanyi is a young, charismatic musician with a large popular following who was elected to the Ugandan parliament around the same time that I was elected to the UK parliament. But while I get to, in a friendly way, be critical of the government without harassment, Bobi has been the target of totally undemocratic behaviour by his. In August of last year, he and 4 other MPs were arrested by the military whilst campaigning at a by-election. His driver was shot dead. He was severely beaten by soldiers before being brought to court on trumped-up charges that were later dropped. Bobi Wine was eventually handed over to police and released. But this is just another example of the Ugandan government using the military to prevent democratically elected politicians doing their job.
The question is that this House has considered democracy in Uganda. Pauline Latham.
Bobi Wine has been arrested multiple times, allegedly tortured and subjected to what human rights organizations have called systematic persecution for daring to challenge Museveni's decades-long grip on power. But here's where it gets interesting. Until now, most African leaders have stayed silent on Uganda's internal politics, following the unwritten rule of non-interference. That all changed 48 hours ago when Ibrahim Traoré broke that silence in the most dramatic way possible. According to sources close to the Burkinabe presidency, Captain Traoré convened an emergency press conference at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou yesterday evening. What he said next left diplomatic channels buzzing and sent Ugandan officials scrambling. In a fiery 20-minute address, Traoré declared that Africa's new generation will no longer tolerate the imprisonment and persecution of voices that speak for the people. We have watched in silence for too long, Traoré reportedly stated, his voice unwavering and filled with conviction. We have allowed the old system to crush our brothers and sisters who dare to dream of a better Africa. Today, I speak not just as the leader of Burkina Faso, but as a voice for millions of young Africans who are tired of watching their heroes suffer in silence. The revolutionary leader then turned his attention directly to President Museveni, and this is where things got really intense. According to transcripts obtained by our sources, Traoré said, "President Museveni, you have a choice to make, and you have 72 hours to make it. Release Bobi Wine and end the persecution of Uganda's democratic voices, or prepare to face consequences that will isolate your government from the new Africa that is being born." The room, according to witnesses present, fell into stunned silence. Nobody expected such a direct confrontation. Nobody anticipated that a relatively young military leader from West Africa would challenge one of East Africa's most entrenched powerhouses. But Ibrahim Traoré has never been one to follow the expected script. Within hours, the statement had gone viral across social media platforms, with the hashtag #FreeWineNow trending in over 30 African countries. Dr. Amara Okoro, a political analyst at the Pan-African Institute for Strategic Studies, told our team, "This is unprecedented. What Traoré has done is break the code of silence that has protected authoritarian practices across the continent for generations. He's essentially saying that the era of looking the other way is over." But not everyone sees it that way. Critics have emerged questioning whether Traoré has the authority or the leverage to make such demands. Professor James Kamathi from Nairobi University raised concerns, stating, "While the sentiment may resonate with many young Africans, we must ask what backing Traoré actually has for these threats." Uganda is a significant military power in East Africa with strong international alliances. Burkina Faso is facing its own security challenges with jihadist insurgencies. This could be political theater rather than substantive diplomacy. The Ugandan government's response has been predictably defiant. In a terse statement released by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a spokesperson said, "Uganda is a sovereign nation that does not take orders from foreign powers, regardless of their revolutionary credentials. Our internal matters are precisely that, internal. We reject any external interference in our democratic processes." To understand why this confrontation matters so much, we need to understand who Bobi Wine really is and why his struggle has captured the imagination of an entire generation. Born in the slums of Kampala, Bobi Wine rose to fame as one of Uganda's biggest music stars, using his platform to sing about poverty, corruption, and the struggles of ordinary Ugandans. His transition from music to politics was meteoric, and his 2021 presidential challenge to Museveni inspired millions, despite ending in what many international observers called a deeply flawed electoral process. Since that election, Bobi Wine has faced relentless pressure. His concerts have been banned, his movements restricted, and his supporters arrested in waves of crackdowns. Just 3 weeks ago, he was detained for the 15th time in 2 years after attempting to hold a rally in Kampala. The charges? Inciting violence, though no evidence was presented to support the accusation. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have documented what they describe as systematic persecution. In a recent report, Amnesty stated, "The pattern of arbitrary detention, torture allegations, and restrictions on freedom of assembly and expression facing Bobi Wine and his supporters represents a severe deterioration of democratic space in Uganda." For Ibrahim Traoré and millions of young Africans, Bobi Wine has become a symbol, a representation of what happens when you challenge entrenched power and why that challenge must continue despite the risks. When Traoré speaks of freeing Bobi Wine, he's speaking to something larger than one man's freedom. He's talking about the freedom of an entire generation to imagine and build a different Africa. So what exactly are these consequences that Traoré has threatened? Our investigative team has been working around the clock to piece together what leverage the Burkinabe leader might actually have, and what we've discovered is both fascinating and potentially explosive. According to confidential sources within the economic community of West African states, Traoré has been quietly building a coalition of like-minded young leaders across the continent. This coalition, which insiders are calling the New Guard, includes military leaders from Mali, Guinea, and potentially Niger, along with vocal support from opposition movements in at least 7 other African nations. Their combined influence could reshape regional politics in ways we haven't seen in decades. The first consequence, our sources suggest, would be a formal proposal at the African Union to suspend Uganda from key decision-making bodies until democratic reforms are implemented. While this might sound symbolic, it would carry significant weight. Uganda currently serves on several important AU committees, and such a suspension would damage its continental standing and potentially affect its peacekeeping operations in Somalia, which bring in millions of dollars annually. The second tier of consequences involves economic pressure. Burkina Faso, despite its challenges, controls significant gold reserves and has been developing new trade partnerships that deliberately bypass traditional Western channels. Traoré has reportedly reached out to leaders in Tanzania, Rwanda, and Kenya, Uganda's East African neighbors, proposing preferential trade agreements that would exclude Uganda unless democratic reforms are made. One source familiar with the discussions told us he's essentially proposing to create an economic corridor that routes around Uganda, which could cost Museveni's government hundreds of millions in transit fees and trade revenues. But perhaps the most intriguing consequence is what's being whispered in diplomatic circles as the youth mobilization strategy. According to leaked communications, Traore's team has been coordinating with Pan-African youth movements to organize a continent-wide day of action demanding Bobi Wine's release. This would include protests, social media campaigns, and direct appeals to international bodies. The goal? To make Bobi Wine's imprisonment such a visible embarrassment that Museveni's allies, both in Africa and internationally, would be forced to pressure him for a resolution. This confrontation isn't happening in a vacuum, and the international implications are staggering. The United States, United Kingdom, and European Union have all expressed concerns about democratic backsliding in Uganda over the years, but their statements have largely been toothless, accompanied by continued aid and diplomatic engagement. Traore's move puts Western powers in an uncomfortable position. Do they support a military leader challenging another leader over democratic principles, or do they maintain their carefully calibrated policy of quiet diplomacy? China, which has significant investments in both Uganda and Burkina Faso, is reportedly watching the situation with great interest. Beijing has traditionally followed a policy of non-interference in African politics, but this confrontation could affect stability in regions where Chinese infrastructure projects are ongoing. A source at the Chinese embassy in Addis Ababa told our correspondent, "We are monitoring the situation and hope all parties can resolve their differences through dialogue and mutual respect." Russia, meanwhile, has been increasing its influence in West Africa, particularly in countries where France has been pushed out. The Wagner Group, despite recent upheavals, still maintains connections in the region. Some analysts suggest that Moscow might see this confrontation as an opportunity to position itself as a mediator, potentially gaining leverage with both sides in the process. But perhaps the most important international dimension isn't found in foreign capitals at all. It's found in the streets of Africa itself, where millions of young people are watching this confrontation unfold with a mixture of hope and anxiety. We've been monitoring social media reactions across the continent, and the response has been overwhelming. In Kampala, underground organizing groups have been galvanized by Traore's statement. One activist who asked to remain anonymous for safety reasons told us, "For years, we've felt alone in this struggle. Seeing an African leader stand up and say what so many are thinking, it gives us hope. It reminds us that change is possible, that we're not crazy for demanding better." In Accra, Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg, young Africans are organizing solidarity rallies and online campaigns. The message is clear. This isn't just about Bobi Wine or Uganda anymore. It's about whether a new generation of Africans can break free from the patterns of the past, where leaders cling to power for decades and crush any opposition that threatens their control. But there are also voices of caution and concern. In Kampala's markets and taxi parks, older Ugandans express worry about external interference. "We don't need another African leader telling us what to do," said one merchant we spoke with via phone. "We have our own problems to solve, our own way." This tension between Pan-African solidarity and national sovereignty lies at the heart of the current crisis. To truly understand what's happening right now, we need to zoom out and look at the bigger historical picture. Africa has been here before, at crossroads where the old guard faces challenges from younger, more radical voices demanding change. In the 1960s, it was the first generation of independence leaders. In the 1990s, it was the wave of democratization that swept the continent after the Cold War ended. But something feels different about this moment. The generation that Traore represents, Africans born after the 1980s who have grown up with mobile phones, internet access, and a fundamentally different vision of what's possible, they're not just asking for incremental reforms. They're demanding a complete reimagining of how power works on the continent. Dr. Fatima Hassan, a historian specializing in post-colonial African politics, explained it to us this way. Previous generational conflicts in African politics were often about who controlled the same systems of power. What we're seeing now is a challenge to the systems themselves. Traore and others like him are saying that the entire model of governance that emerged from independence, centralized, personality-driven, often authoritarian, that model is obsolete. The question is whether this challenge will succeed or whether it will crash against the rocks of entrenched power, regional politics, and international interests that have a stake in maintaining the status quo. As of this broadcast, approximately 48 hours remain in Traore's ultimatum. What happens when that deadline expires? Nobody knows for certain, but the possibilities range from diplomatic breakthrough to serious escalation. Scenario 1, Museveni makes a surprise concession, perhaps releasing Bobi Wine under house arrest or allowing him more freedom of movement while maintaining some restrictions. This would allow the Ugandan leader to save face while diffusing the immediate crisis. Our sources suggest back-channel communications are already underway, with mediators from Tanzania and South Africa attempting to find a middle ground. Scenario 2, Museveni calls Traore's bluff, refusing to budge and daring the Burkinabe leader to follow through on his threats. This could lead to the escalation measures we discussed earlier, AU motions, economic pressure, and continent-wide protests. The risk here is that such a confrontation could split the African Union along generational and ideological lines, weakening the organization at a time when continental unity is desperately needed. Scenario 3, a wildcard event changes the entire dynamic. Perhaps other African leaders step forward to either support Traore's position or condemn it. Perhaps international pressure increases dramatically. Perhaps something happens on the ground in Uganda that shifts the entire conversation. In African politics, the only constant is unpredictability. But beyond the immediate crisis, this confrontation raises profound questions about Africa's future that will outlast whatever happens in the next 72 hours. Can African leaders hold each other accountable without being accused of neocolonial interference? Can a new generation of leadership emerge without violent conflict with the old guard? Can democratic aspirations survive in environments where security challenges, economic pressures, and historical grievances create constant instability? Ibrahim Traore's ultimatum to Yoweri Museveni over Bobi Wine's freedom is really about all of these larger questions. It's a test case for whether African solidarity can mean something more than just silence in the face of injustice. It's a challenge to the assumption that sovereignty means the right to oppress your own people without external criticism. It's a declaration that the rules of the game are changing, whether the old players are ready or not. So here we are, watching the clock count down on one of the most dramatic confrontations in modern African politics. A 35-year-old revolutionary leader from West Africa has challenged one of East Africa's most entrenched strongmen over the freedom of a musician-turned-activist who represents the hopes of millions. The stakes couldn't be higher. The implications couldn't be more far-reaching. What happens next will be written in the history books. It will be studied by future generations trying to understand this pivotal moment when Africa's youth refuse to accept the status quo. Whether it ends in triumph or tragedy, compromise or confrontation, one thing is already clear. The conversation about power, democracy, and freedom in Africa will never be the same. This is a defining moment. The whole continent is watching. The whole world is watching. And somewhere in Kampala, Bobi Wine is watching too, wondering if this time finally things might actually change. So I want to hear from you. What do you think Ibrahim Traore should do when the 72 hours expire? Do you think Museveni will back down? And what does this confrontation mean for the future of democracy in Africa? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with everyone who needs to know what's happening right now. And make sure you're subscribed because we'll be bringing you updates as this situation develops in real time. The countdown is on, history is being made, and we're all witnesses to what comes next.